So thank you, everybody, for coming to the seminar today. We are pleased to have Dr. Robert Rosenbaum providing a lecture for us. Some background for Robert is that he earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Houston in 2011. He is currently an associate professor and director of graduate studies at the University of Notre Dame. He has worked in areas such as neural circuit modeling, biological and artificial neural networks, neural excitation and inhibition balances, and cortical circuits. And we look forward to hearing about his research on dimensions in networks today. So please begin, Robert.
Thank you. So let's see. Let me know if anybody has any trouble seeing my slides or hearing me. Okay. Yeah, so today I'll talk about some work I did with an undergrad. So I want to kind of lead with this slide, thanking the undergrad who worked with me on this project. So to make sure I have time to do that and I don't rush through it at the end. So the work is on the dimensionality of network connectivity and how it relates to the dimensionality of the activity on a network. Let me just try to minimize something. I guess it's fine. Can't find my mouse, but oh, it's on my other monitor. There we go. No, maybe? Okay, no problem. Yeah, ideally I could see my mouse, but I guess I can't, which is fine. I won't be able to point to things, but I think that should be okay. I don't know why my mouse is not visible. To start with, I just want to talk about what I mean by dimensionality of a network. So a network is really just another name for a graph. A directed graph is what I'm interested in here in particular, which has an adjacency matrix. I'll call it W here. When we have this adjacency matrix, we can look at its singular value decomposition. If we see something on the left like this, where the singular values kind of decay smoothly with their rank, then we'll call this network structure high dimensional. So in order to describe a large percentage of the structure of the network, you need to account for a lot of the sort of singular the modes, I guess, is the best way to say that. On the right, we have what I would consider a low dimensional network, where you have a couple of singular values that dominate. And what this tells us is that you can describe sort of most of the structure of this network in 2 dimensions. So it's kind of an approximately rank 2 network. It's not strictly speaking rank 2, but if these smaller singular values that you see here, if you were to approximate them as 0, then it would be exactly rank 2. So there are 2 dominant ranks, basically, or dimensions in the network. So this is what I mean throughout this talk by a low dimensional network. So if you have a network with this structure, if the larger singular values are asymptotically larger than the smaller ones here, when I'm talking about asymptotics, I'm really talking about the limit of large network size. So as the network grows larger and larger, more nodes. But we don't need to, in most cases, I think just that sort of hand-wavy notion of larger is enough here. So if you have a network with this structure asymptotically, you can write it as a sum of a low rank matrix. W naught here is a matrix that's truly low rank. So for this picture on the right, it would be rank 2. Plus a matrix that's potentially full rank. And the epsilon here is indicating that the full rank part is a lot smaller than the low rank part. So we'll use this decomposition several times in the talk. So we can always write a network with this low dimensional structure of this form. So there's been some work recently sort of in the physics and network science literature showing that a lot of networks in real life have this sort of low dimensional or low rank structure, in the sense that using different, now if we want to assign a number to the sort of effective rank, there are a lot of ways of measuring this, having to do with the decay of the singular values and other ways of measuring it. But here they use what is called the S rank, which is just another way to measure this. And they show that a lot of networks and that come up in applications in nature are effectively low rank in the sense that this S rank measure is less than like 10%, right? A full rank matrix would have it, or a matrix, the identity matrix or some matrix where the singular values are relatively flat, this S rank would be close to 1. So a lot of networks that come up in real life, you can describe a lot of their structure with just a couple of dimensions or a few dimensions or something like that. So these are important to sort of understand in terms of their properties. So I'm also going to talk about the dimensionality of dynamics on a network. And this is something potentially a little bit different. So here now we have, we can treat each node as a variable that changes in time, and the network somehow describes the dynamics of these nodes. And we'll talk a little bit about how to connect the network to the dynamics. But now I want to talk about what it means to say that the dynamics are low dimensional. Before it was the structure of the connectivity being low dimensional. So the dynamics are really just a collection of time series here, like we see on the left. There's a number of time samples and a number of here I'm interpreting the individual nodes as neurons, and more generally they're just nodes, right? And sometimes in dynamics, you'll see something like the picture on the right. So this is really just a cartoon. In reality, we're talking about much larger embedding dimensions. But here we have an embedding dimension of 3. So there are 3 nodes or 3 time series. But the trajectory of the dynamics lives very close to a 2-dimensional manifold, right? So we'd say these dynamics are not exactly 2-dimensional because they don't lie perfectly on this hyperplane, this 2-dimensional plane in 3-dimensional space, but they lie close to it, right? Which is to say, we can describe a large portion of the variability in these dynamics by looking at just these 2 dimensions, U1 and U2, which don't necessarily correspond to the sort of indicator vectors for each dimension. So they can be tilted with respect to the N1 and N2 and N3 bases. So how do we, in reality, we'll be looking at much higher dimensional embeddings other than 3, but of course it's harder to draw this. So how do we measure this dimensionality? How can we say that, these are approximately 2-dimensional dynamics? So an easy and common way to do this is to look at the variance explained by each principal component. So we'll also denote this with a sigma because it's actually also a singular value. So this is related to the kth singular value of the covariance matrix of the dynamics. And it tells us how much variance is explained by the kth principal component. So, we'll call dynamics high and low dimensional under the same conditions, basically on these singular values as we applied to the connectivity structure, right? So we'll look at the singular values of the covariance matrix, which again are related to the variance explained by principal components. And on the right, we would say this is a low dimensional, this represents low dimensional dynamics, and on the left, high dimensional. The idea here is on the right, the first 2 principal components describe a large percentage of the variance. This is a log scale, so this is maybe 90% of the variance or something like that, right? So in a picture like this, 90% of the variance of the process is described here in a 2-dimensional plane, right? Like in the picture we saw before. So we'll call this these dynamics low dimensional. So the key here is that, the dynamics don't live perfectly on a low dimensional manifold, but most of them live in a low dimensional manifold. Similarly with the network structure W, it's not truly a low rank matrix, but it's sort of close to a low rank matrix. Jonathan, did you
I
have a
think we have
question?
a question.
Yeah, just if you can refresh me about singular value decomposition. So that's a linear decomposition. So you
Yes.
will identify linear manifolds on which you live. So if you have, for instance, a periodic orbit, it will not find 1D, right? It will find whatever dimension.
Yeah. So I'm talking about just linear measures of dimensionality here. So for example, if you had a 1-dimensional periodic orbit, but that periodic orbit where it was curved or rippled in space, then it would in this linear measure of dimensionality look higher than 1-dimensional.
Sounds good. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't capture um, um, nonlinear manifolds and the fact that they could be potentially lower dimensional, right? So it gives you, in some sense, an upper bound on nonlinear dimensionality in some sense, right? If it's a curved manifold, then you won't be able to pick up on that.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's one, limitation of this approach. But then the question, using this measure of dimensionality, a question sort of I'm interested in here is, what is the relationship between the dimensionality of the structure of connectivity in a network and the dynamics that are generated on that network? If somehow W represents interactions between the nodes in a dynamical system, how is the dimensionality of the structure related to the dimensionality of the dynamics when we're using these measures of dimensionality that I mentioned before? And this is mostly binary. I'm going to do things asymptotically. So the question is, are there dominant modes or are there not, right? And how many, but it's a discrete number here. So it is a restrictive definition of dimensionality I'm using here, but this is the question I'm kind of interested in. So part of the reason I got interested in this is, I study computational neuroscience, and there's a lot of discussion right now, and maybe over the last decade or so, about the dimensionality of neural activity that are measured in animals. So here are several examples when recordings from different species of animals demonstrated low dimensional dynamics. So maybe you're recording from hundreds of neurons, but the dynamics tend to live close to a lower dimensional manifold. Sometimes linear, like we see on the left here, and on the top right, here's a nonlinear manifold coding for head direction. So here's, I guess, a good example on the top right. Here's a manifold that would appear to be one-dimensional if you used a nonlinear measure of dimensionality that could pick up on the fact that all these points lie close to a curve, or three-dimensional if you used a linear measure of dimension. But in either case, this comes from recordings of hundreds of neurons, so it'd be low dimensional either way, just lower if you can tease out the nonlinearity, which our measures can't. So there's a lot of work showing low dimensionality. But one thing I would like to point out in these data sets, I don't have time to go through exactly how all of them are generated, but maybe the top right one is a good one to start from. What's going on here is they're measuring from neurons in a mouse's brain that code for the position of the mouse's head. And if you think about the position of the mouse's head, it itself lives on a one-dimensional manifold, right? Which is just the circle, right? Topologically equivalent to the circle. It's a periodic one-dimensional manifold. On the left, for example, top left, for example, the animal is watching movies, very simple movies of drifting gratings. These are just like bars of light and dark color, which themselves live in a two-dimensional manifold. So it's perhaps not surprising then that we see neurons that code for low-dimensional stimuli or motor behavior might live on a low-dimensional manifold. So it's sort of intrinsic to the stimulus that these neurons are coding. So one lesson from this is it seems that low-dimensional dynamics are observed during low-dimensional tasks or stimuli. That's not necessarily surprising. That's sort of what we would expect. It's cool that we can tease that out and find it in the data, but maybe it shouldn't be surprising to us. So there are other data where the animals are exposed to higher dimensional stimuli, for example, natural images, which live in a higher dimensional space instead of 2 or 3 dimensions, at least tens or hundreds of dimensions. Granted, the space of natural images is, thought to, so natural images are thought to live in a lower dimensional manifold than the pixel space in which they're embedded, but still higher dimensional than 2 or 3, right? And people see that in response to these higher dimensional stimuli, this is something that's difficult to measure because you really need to record from a lot of neurons to be able to measure this. But more recently, people were able to do this and found that when you present these high dimensional stimuli and record from a lot of neurons, the dimensionality of the neural activity is also high, matching the stimulus. So, high dimensional dynamics are observed in response to high dimensional stimuli. So we don't necessarily see low-dimensional dynamics if the stimulus is not low-dimensional. And I want to compare this to some work. So I mentioned before, in the physics and network science literature, people have become interested in low-dimensional networks and dynamics on them. So here's a paper that was published, I guess, a few years ago now, that kind of discovered a lot of low-dimensional structure and revealed a lot of low-dimensional structure in networks that come from nature and applications. And they proved a theorem that kind of derived conditions under which these networks with low-dimensional structure also produce low-dimensional dynamics. So they said, under these conditions, and we don't have to dig through the exact statement of this theorem. It's kind of complicated. This is from their supplementary material. You can see that this is supplementary equation 214 in theorem 72. So there's a lot going on under the hood before this. But the takeaway message is that they derive some conditions under which a network with low-dimensional structure also produces low-dimensional dynamics. So they connected structure and dynamics, like we said at the beginning we were going to do. But I want to point something out about this paper, though. They assumed in this paper that dynamics take this form here. So the Z here represents the vector of nodes of the network, and W is the connectivity. And they assume that it obeys a dynamical system that's a function of Z itself. So this can have to do with the relaxation dynamics of Z or something like that. And the sort of WZ represents sort of the input or interactions between the nodes here. And I think there's something missing from this F here. And that's that there's no external input or perturbations. This is a self-contained network. The only thing that affects Z is another element of Z, right? And the only thing that affects one element of Z is another. So this is a completely intrinsic system, right? So this assumption is common in a lot of studies of low-rank networks. And the conclusions they reached in this paper are sensitive to this assumption. But networks in nature, I argue, are almost never isolated from external inputs or perturbations or noise or something like this, right? It's very rarely the case where you have a system that is entirely self-contained that we can model. You could argue if you're doing neuroscience. Well, you could argue in some situations that the brain is self-contained, but even the brain receives external stimuli. And I think second to that, I think maybe more relevant, we're often not modeling the entire brain, but we're modeling some sub-network in the brain that's receiving input from another subnetwork that's outside of our model, right? So oftentimes this picture on the bottom is a more realistic picture of what we are or want to be modeling. So here I've just added dependence on X, some input or perturbation, right?
I'm sorry, Robert, just
Sure.
a quick question. Could you say, are there any assumptions on F? I'm just trying to understand how you could get anything low dimensional from this if F is arbitrary.
You could argue this you can represent any dynamical system of this form, right? You don't even need the WZ, right? So in this paper, what they did is they wrote the conclusions in terms of the Jacobian with respect to these two variables, right? So if the Jacobian with respect to the first variable is very strong, then of course, a lot of these assumptions can be, then the network can behave basically in any way, right? But if it's small compared to the dependence on the second variable, then you can say some things. So you can see here these JX and JY terms represent that. So what I'm going to be talking about, actually what I do is, I wrote this equation on the bottom as sort of a visual guide here. But what I actually do in the derivations and proofs that I make is I define W as define W in terms of F. So the system that I really look at is F of ZX. So I leave out the explicit WZ, and then I define W in terms of the Jacobian of F with respect to Z. So then now what we've done, we need to, the disadvantage is we have to linearize, and we only get one W for each linearization around, some fixed point that we care about. But the advantage is that W follows naturally from F itself. And then in this talk today, I'll actually just focus on a linear system, right, where W is very explicitly defined. But this is basically the normal form that you get from this linearization that I mentioned before. So if you have, going back to this slide, if you use the equation on the bottom here, but you get rid of the WZ, so just dz dt equals f of zx, you assume that there's some fixed point, z star or whatever, that you want to linearize around. You linearize around that fixed point, then define W to be the Jacobian around that fixed point. Then you end up with a system that looks like this. Or you might also have to rescale X by its Jacobian. But for the purpose of this talk, I think it's interesting enough, actually, just to focus on this linear system, and then a lot of the conclusions I reach generalize to the linearization of the nonlinear system. So I can talk more about that linearization later, but for our purposes now, let's just focus on this simple linear system of ODEs, right? So it's so here the negative z really tells us that in the absence of interactions, in the absence of either external input x or interactions from the local network, everything just decays to zero. So we're linearizing around this fixed point at zero. And then we have two sources of inputs or perturbations to the network. One is interactions, WZ, and the other is external input, right? So one way to interpret this. So this is a very literal linear interpretation of the picture here on the right, right? And this is a model that comes up in computational neuroscience a lot. Okay, and so what I'm going to assume about the network connectivity, W, well, actually, before we assume anything in general, let's just consider one specific example. So here I'm going to take a very simple example. W is going to have this low-rank structure, and the low-rank part W naught is just going to be one-dimensional. So we're going to have an approximate rank 1 structure. The structure of W is going to be dominated by one dimension, which is just the outer product of some vector, U transpose here, right? Just a random vector, actually, is what we use in practice. And then the rest of the matrix is just a random component with sort of an order 1 spectral radius. So rho here is 0.5 in this simulation, and C is -10. And then I'm going to perturb the network with just some random noise. So the external input, I'm just going to let it be a smooth Gaussian process in IID. So it's high dimensional. Every neuron is receiving a separate copy of noise. In that sense, I chose it to be IID, so it's high dimensional. So the question is not whether the network produces low dimensional dynamics from low dimensional input, but whether it can generate it intrinsically from the low dimensional structure, right? The singular values of the covariance matrix of X look like this. They would be flat in theory if we took an infinite sample. This green dots would be flat, but because it's a finite sample from which I'm computing the principal components, there's some decay just due to finite size effects. And then I'm going to ask, now we push this X through this dynamical system, relatively simple dynamical system. What does the what do the principal components or the singular values of the covariance matrix of Z look like coming back out the other end, right? A relatively simple question in a linear system, right? So does Z inherit the low dimensional structure that we see in W or something else? And one thing I'm going to mention throughout the entire talk, I'm going to assume that the dynamics are stable around a fixed point, the fixed point here being 0. So we have stable dynamics, which means W does not have any eigenvalues larger than 1, right? And that we will see that's an important point here. So here's what we get. Z is not low dimensional in the sense that there is not one dominant singular value here, right? Compare this to W, which has a dominant singular value, right? So we have a low dimensional network, a low dimensional structure, but we get high dimensional dynamics, right? So we can't explain a lot of the variability with a small number of singular values like we can in the network structure. Of course, one thing that you're going to notice if you look at this, here I'm talking about the dimensionality of Z. I'm focused on the left, the dominant principal components don't dominate strongly. But one thing you're going to notice is that there's one principal component that explains a very small amount of variability, right? So the separated principal component is kind of the opposite, on the opposite side of what we see in the structure of W, right? And what's going on here is this is U. This is actually the dominant singular vector of W, the connectivity. What we see here is the variability along this direction U is much smaller than the variability along here. I've just chosen a random direction, right? So we see a lot less variability along the direction that W likes to point. And this is exactly opposite of what we would see in a feed-forward network. A feed-forward network, by definition, transfers the variability of its inputs proportionally to its singular values, right? And here we see something opposite to that, right? The dominant directions in W tend to get suppressed in the response, right? And just compare that to what happened with X, of course, is totally unstructured and doesn't even know about U. So we get similar variability in both directions. So this isn't coming from the input, but somehow coming from the filtering that the network is imposing on the input. So I call this phenomenon low rank suppression. The idea is that we have a network with low rank structure, and in some situations, it will suppress input in that direction instead of amplifying input in that direction. So here's another demonstration of it. Here, instead of giving noise input, I can just give two static inputs. So first, I give an input to the network X that's equal to U. So it points along the same direction that W points. And we see a relatively weak response in Z versus a random perturbation. Now I'm just hitting the network with an input vector that's pointing in some random direction. We see a much stronger response in Z. So the network is responding more strongly to random inputs than to inputs that are aligned to the dominant direction in the connectivity matrix, right? If you think about this for a little while, you're going to come up with an explanation that looks like this. So W has a large singular value, right? And the dynamics are stable. In many cases, what this tells us is that W has an eigenvalue with large negative real part, right? So W points strongly in some direction, but it's got to point strongly in that direction with a negative eigenvalue if the dynamics are to be stable, right? So this tells you there's a dominant negative eigenvalue with eigenvector U, and so it's going to especially suppress things along direction U, right? So this is not necessarily surprising when we return to the assumption that dynamics here are stable, right? They're stable, so it can't strongly amplify the direction U, it must strongly suppress it instead. And that's true for this example, but that's because, and you can see this here, here's the eigenspectrum here of W. So we see a dominant negative eigenvalue, and its eigenvector is U, and its eigenvalue here is -10. And of course, that's why it suppresses direct inputs in that direction. So nothing very deep here, but this explanation assumes that W is normal, which it is in this case. W is normal in this case. So in this case, this is the correct explanation for what's going on. But I want to make the point that this explanation does not generalize. So now I'm going to consider another example. So the same dynamics, W has the same singular value distribution. So one dominant singular value and the rest much smaller. But now, you know, if you see left on the left here, the thing that I X'd out, I would be pointing to this with my mouse right now, but it's invisible. Instead of the dominant singular left and right singular vectors being the same, which gives us a normal matrix, I take the low rank part of W, which is called W naught, to be C times U times V transpose, where U and V are independent normal random vectors. We can think of them as just being orthogonal. They're not exactly orthogonal because they're just random, but they are close to orthogonal, right? Because high dimensional random vectors are near orthogonal, right? So in this case, we still get a large singular vector exactly at C, which is 10, right? A dominant singular vector. You see that on the left here, but we don't get a dominant eigenvalue. So the eigenvalue spectrum is nicely contained in this ball of radius close to 0.5, which really just comes from the random part, W1, right? So we don't have a large negative eigenvalue anymore, but we still see this low rank suppression. So there is still a direction, not exactly U here, but a small perturbation away from U, in which inputs are suppressed compared to random perturbations, right? So we still see this low rank suppression, even though we don't have this large negative eigenvalue, right? Okay, sorry. So we still see low rank suppression. So we still see suppression of inputs in this one direction compared to random directions, even though W itself amplifies inputs in the direction U, and even this direction U plus this perturbation, right? However, now we do see low dimensional dynamics in this case, right? So here, remember, in blue is the percent variance explained by each principal component of Z, or also the singular values of the covariance matrix of Z, and we see one dominant singular value, right? Which is to say that a large percentage of the variability of Z is captured in a single dimension. So Z is mostly living on a line, basically, right? Okay, so just to summarize, when W is normal, we saw low rank suppression. We saw one direction in input space in which responses were suppressed, and we saw high dimensional dynamics. We didn't see any dominant direction in which dynamics were especially strong, right? When W was not normal, this is of course just for this particular choice of W, we still saw low rank suppression, but we saw low dimensional dynamics, right? So low rank suppression seems to occur whether or not W is normal, but the dimensionality of dynamics depended on whether W was a normal matrix, right? So these are just two examples. So what we wanted to understand after kind of, seeing what happened with these two examples is, what are the conditions under which each of these two apply, right? Is it just normality? Is there something else going on under the hood, right? So low rank suppression doesn't seem to depend on normality. Does it depend on something else? And secondly, does the dimensionality of dynamics depend on normality or something sharper, right? So let's look at low rank suppression first, because that's the simpler thing. So this is the idea that the response Z is suppressed, the inputs in X at a certain direction are suppressed relative to other directions, right? Strongly suppressed relative to other directions. So we're going to make a few assumptions that are consistent with the examples we just looked at. First, W is strongly low rank. What I mean by that, basically, you can read the details here, but basically what I mean by that is that there's a small number of dominant singular values, right? Like we see on the right here, there's one, it could be two, it could be three. We need an order one number of singular values that are asymptotically larger than the rest, right? And this lets us do this decomposition where we can write the low rank part, W naught, which is truly rank R, and the rest is kind of interpreted as noise here, right? Okay. The second assumption I'm going to make is that dynamics are hyperbolically stable. Again, right now, let's just look at this linear system here, right? So let's just assume now that the fixed point at 0 is hyperbolically stable, and something slightly stronger than that. We don't only want that the eigenvalues of the Jacobian are negative, but that they're bounded away from 0. So we don't want any of them getting close to 0 either, right? Which is to say, another way to say that is that the eigenvalues of W are bounded away from 1 to the left, right? C here needs to be positive for this to be true. So the claim here, which is actually relatively easy to show once you kind of get everything set up, is that for each one of these low rank dimensions, so for each K from 1 to R, here it's just one dimension, you get an input, which is close to the left singular vector in that dimension, for which the response is large, but in the direction of the right singular vector. So inputs close to the dominant left singular vectors are amplified in the direction of the dominant right singular vectors. And this is actually opposite of a feed-forward network. In a feed-forward network, inputs in the direction of the dominant right singular vector are amplified in the direction of the left singular vector, right? So in a recurrent network, we get the opposite thing. This follows relatively straightforward from linear algebra. Once you get things set up right, you just work it out. But we don't really need any other assumptions about the structure of W here. So this applies relatively generally under these couple of assumptions, and this matches what we saw in those simulations where we saw in both cases when W was normal or not normal. In both cases, we saw this low rank suppression dynamic. The more interesting and sort of difficult condition is these high dimensional dynamics. So here we make, first of all, the same two first assumptions, but we'll need more. So again, we assume that W is strongly low rank. It has a small number of dominant singular vectors. We assume that dynamics are hyperbolically stable around a fixed point. Here, we'll just, since we're looking at this linear system, put that fixed point at 0. And now we have a time-dependent X, because we want to look at the time scale of dynamics. So we don't want to just look at the response to a static input, but what happens is X is changing in time. So what do we need to assume about X? Well, to really talk about what we mean by high or low dimensional dynamics, we need a covariance matrix to talk about. So I assume that X is a high dimensional stationary ergodic process, in which case Z is also a stationary ergodic process. And then we can talk about its stationary covariance matrix, which is really what we care about, right? I'm also going to assume here, so my assumption that it's high dimensional is not a necessary or strong assumption. If X is low dimensional, then we sort of get low dimensional dynamics for free, right? So here I'm sort of assuming it's high dimensional, so we're asking the right question, right? When does the network itself give low dimensional dynamics instead of when does the input drive low dimensional dynamics? I'm also going to assume that X is slowly varying in the sense that the time scale at which X varies is slower than tau, the time scale of the intrinsic dynamics. This assumption actually isn't 100% necessary, but it makes the analysis simpler. We understand what happens when X is more quickly varying, but we need to move to the spectral domain, and it would take a little more time for me to explain. So I think this particular case is interesting enough that we can just talk about this right now. And if you want, I can kind of tell you what goes on when it's not so slowly varying. But for now, let's just assume that. So if X varies more slowly than tau, then basically as X is varying, tau controls how quickly Z converges to a fixed point, right? And if X is varying slowly, then we can make this quasi-steady state approximation that as X is changing, Z always has time to decay to the fixed point that it would exist at if X were fixed at that value, right? This is called a quasi-static or quasi-steady state approximation. And what we get out of that is this equation at the bottom, that Z is approximated by this linear function of X, right? You get something similar if you don't assume X is slowly varying. I know I said I wouldn't talk about it, but you have to move to the frequency domain and you get some filtering and things like that. But you can basically do everything I'm doing here. You just have to account for the full spectrum of frequencies. So I'm doing it this way mostly for simplicity. Okay, well, if Z is approximately equal to this, then and if X is high dimensional, or another way to say, if it's in elements of X are IID, then the covariance matrix of Z we can show looks like this basically, right? This I minus W inverse minus I times I minus W inverse transpose. So this is a common result in linear systems theory, that you get something like this. And so now our question about whether Z is high dimensional really becomes a question, this question here. So assume that W has a small number of large singular values, right? This is the assumption one, basically, that it's a low rank, approximately low rank matrix, right? We're asking now just a pure linear algebra question. If Z is dominated by a small number of singular values, under what if W is dominated by a small number of singular values, under what conditions is I minus W inverse also dominated by a small number of singular values, right? So we've distilled everything. Now we don't even need to talk about dynamics or anything like that. We've distilled everything to just a pure question in linear algebra, which is a lot of fun to do when you're working with undergrads, because they're taking linear algebra and things like this. So it was nice when we got to this point working with my undergrad, because now it's basically turned into a easy to state, but as it turns out, somewhat difficult question in linear algebra. So first of all, we showed that if W naught, which is the low rank part of W, is a normal matrix, then Z is high dimensional. So basically what happens in that case is that the singular values obey, this is I minus W inverse, I minus W to the minus T. The singular values would just look like 1 over 1 minus the singular values of W squared, right? So basically the transformations that we're making to W in this equation, you can just apply directly to the singular values, right? And so what this says is that when W has large singular values, those turn into small singular values of C because of this inverse, right? I hope that makes sense. Okay, that's fine. Normal matrix is taken care of. Then we showed, but it's not sharp. So we have plenty of examples of matrices that are not normal, for which dynamics are high dimensional, even though W is low dimensional. So we were able to prove something a little bit sharper. That is, if W naught is an EP matrix, so EP stands for equal projector. So this is a class of matrices you don't actually hear referred to very often. If you try to read about it, most of the literature is like from the 70s and 80s and early 90s and things like that. For some reason, they don't come up as often as you might expect. So what's an EP matrix? Has anybody here heard of an EP matrix or worked with them? Every time I give this talk to mathematicians, I always ask this question, and I've never had anybody say yes. So an EP matrix is so the only interesting case is when it's a rank deficient matrix, so a matrix that's not full rank, and it's a matrix whose column space is equal to its row space. So it's a superclass of normal matrices. In a normal matrix, the left and right singular vectors are equal to each other. So U1 is equal to U2 and V1 is equal to V2. In EP matrix, the span of the left singular vectors is equal to the span of the right singular vectors. These spans are just the row space and the column space, right? So basically, the matrix and its transpose have the same range, is another way to say it, right? So we were able to show this larger class of matrices also gives rise to high dimensional dynamics. And then we can take it one step further, since we're really talking about the asymptotics here. It's okay if it's not fully EP, if it has a small, if it has, well, let's say this another way. First of all, if it has a small component that's not EP, things are still high dimensional. Even if it's like 50-50 EP and non-EP, things are high dimensional. So the way we're able to phrase this is by defining what's called the alignment matrix. So we take U and V, the dominant left and right singular vectors, the matrices with those vectors as columns, and you take their product V transpose U, which this is a small matrix P. It's R by R, where R is the rank of the low rank part of W, right? So in the cases we're looking at, it's 1 or 2 dimensional, right? So P would be a 2 by 2 matrix if this was a network with approximate rank 2 structure. And the individual elements of P represent the dot products of the individual left and right singular vectors, right? So P23 is V2 dot U3, right? So this is kind of keeping track of all the dot products of all mixed left and right singular vectors, right? And we were able to show if P does not have any asymptotically small singular values, then dynamics are high dimensional. This is a kind of a roundabout way to say that if W naught has a non-vanishing EP component is really what's going on here. So it's really this middle theorem that's doing the heavy lifting here. And this bottom theorem says that it's okay if this, EP condition only applies sort of partly here. Okay, I'm gonna skip over this part because it's I think less interesting. So now we have so actually that's what I know there was something else I wanted to mention. We actually were only able to, you notice none of these theorems are if and only if. So we were only able to show implication in one direction in at least the second 2 theorems here. So we weren't able to prove their converse, even though in all the examples that we've looked at, the converse is also true. Like this is the only way to get high dimensional dynamics. So I would definitely be interested if anybody has, thinks they might have an approach to prove the converse. I'd be happy to talk, or if you want to read over it and see if you can dream something up. We've been unable to do that, which I think goes to show that even though all of this this is here I'm only looking at a linear system and basically just doing linear algebra and these asymptotes. Things can still be difficult when you're talking about linear algebra, right? Okay, so In the time that I have left, I want to talk about, you know, we looked at conditions under which, so in the beginning of the talk, I guess I said that a lot of natural networks give rise to low rank structure, right? This structure where you have a handful of dominant singular vectors. Then we derive conditions on the remaining structure of this low rank part to know whether dynamics should be high or low dimensional. So now I want to go through some examples of natural network structures that come up in applications and ask whether they satisfy this condition, whether we'd predict that they give low or high dimensional dynamics, and what it means that they might produce this low rank suppression that I was talking about. So the first I'd like to address is a modular structure. So this is, you know, in a network, this would be if you had a subpopulation of your nodes that interact with each other in a different way than a different subpopulation. A classic example, and so this gives rise, first of all, to a block structure in your adjacency matrix. You can see here this structure, and here we have two subpopulations, and they interact with each other in different ways, right? Each of the four pairings between the two give you different statistics in this block form of W here. So a classic example is in networks of neurons, which is really where this example comes from. We have excitatory neurons, which only send outgoing connections that are positive, and inhibitory neurons only send outgoing projections that are negative. And you see that structure in this W here, right? The columns are either purely positive or purely negative, where they're non-zero. So the network is sparse, right? So they're either 0 or positive in a column or 0 and negative in another column, right? And we get this block structure. So if each block has biased weights, which it must in this network with positive and negative blocks, right? If they were unbiased, everything would just have to be 0, right? Then it has a low dimensional structure that meets our conditions. And I want to point out that actually I should have said this on the slide, it meets our conditions in the sense that the matrix is EP, but it's not normal. So we did need this sharper here. We need this sharper version of the theorem that says it's not sufficient. You don't necessarily need for the matrix to be normal, but it's enough that it's EP. So the P here, we have two dominant singular vectors corresponding to the two subpopulations of the network here. Two dominant singular values, and so this alignment matrix P is a 2x2 matrix, and you can just tell by looking at it that it's non-singular, right, or not close to singular. It doesn't have any singular values close to 0. In fact, both singular values are close to 1, right? And so we expect low dimensional dynamics, which we see, but I think the more interesting phenomenon here is this low rank suppression that I was talking about. So in a network with modular structure, what does it mean to say that the inputs are aligned to the low dimensional structure of the network? Remember, I said that in these low rank networks, inputs aligned to the low rank structure, so inputs aligned to this U vector, are going to be suppressed by the network, right? And random inputs are going to be amplified in comparison, right? Well, a vector that's aligned to this low rank structure is in the span of the column space, which because it's EP is also the span of the row space. So I don't have to specify which one I'm talking about, which means that it's uniform across all of each population. So you can see that here in this red line. Here's a vector that's aligned to the low rank structure of W, meaning that all of the nodes in one population get the same input and all the nodes in the other population get the same input. So it has this population constant structure to it versus a random input in gray here, which is just independent of the structure of the connectivity. And you see when we stimulate the network with this structured input, we see a muted response compared to a random input. And this is important in the theory of excitatory inhibitory networks here. It says that if you stimulate all excitatory neurons the same and all inhibitory neurons the same, you're going to get a suppressed response compared to stimulating each neuron differently. And this is closely related to the theory of excitatory and inhibitory balance, and actually explains some phenomena that me and my colleagues observed in these networks before we did this work. This is kind of what actually motivated us to start doing this work. So this is, related to EI balance. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. So another structure that I'm interested in, I know I'm running low on time here, is spatial structure. So this is a network in which nearby nodes are connected more strongly or are more likely to be connected. So the idea is the nodes live in some space. Here, just we're going to assume they live on a circle, so just a line with periodic coordinates, and nearby nodes are connected more strongly than nodes that are further away from each other. These networks have a low-dimensional structure that's also EP. The singular values are represent the Fourier coefficients of this connectivity kernel that determines how strongly they're connected at a certain distance. This theory is well known. And the prediction here from low-rank suppression now is that if you provide an external stimulus to this network that's smooth in space, so it respects this spatial structure here in red, you'll get a muted response compared to a stimulus that's random in space. To kind of see this, you have to look at the y-axis, at the vertical axes on these right-hand plots. So a smooth stimulus gives responses on the order of 0.01, whereas a disordered or random stimulus gives that's not arranged in space in a smooth way gives a much stronger response. The final example, I'll kind of just jump to in the interest of time. I know we're I guess, a couple minutes, I guess. So we considered a real-world network from this paper that I've talked about a couple of times. So it's a network representing the proximity of students in a high school. It was recorded by tracking 637 students and keeping track of in a school week how many times whether they came into contact with each other. It's a binary network. And this paper showed that this network has a low-rank structure. So a handful of principal components are much larger than the remaining. It's not as cleanly separated as the examples I've looked at so far, but you can tell that a lot of the structure is explained by the first 6 or 7 singular values. But in that work, as I mentioned before, they only considered self-contained dynamics. So they used epidemiological dynamics that look like this equation here. There's no perturbations or noise here, right? dz dt only depends on z, right? I would argue in real epidemiological networks and real populations of people, there is a lot of external input. There are siblings, there's noise, there are other students that aren't accounted for in this network. There's a lot going on that's not captured by just the interactions in the network. So we instead considered a network with an x of t, which we, again, just modeled as noise. There's not many assumptions we can make on the structure of x of t here. And first of all, we saw high dimensional dynamics, unlike the low dimensional dynamics they saw in the paper. And I think, secondly, which is not shown here, I didn't show the plot, but we saw this low-rank suppression. What this low-rank suppression tells us is that perturbations to this network, if they don't respect the low-rank structure, so if they're made orthogonal or random with respect to the low-rank structure in the network, you see a stronger response. So this tells us that interventions in epidemiological networks might be more effective if they are random or orthogonal to the structure and the underlying network versus if they respect this structure. So it's a real prediction in a real network. So conclusions, since I'm low on time, I'll just kind of jump through these. Networks in nature are not self-contained. So when we're talking about modeling dynamics, we should account for external input and noise. I think that's one lesson I really want to emphasize here. When we do this, we find that low-dimensional networks with low-rank structure, can produce high-dimensional responses to high-dimensional perturbations or inputs. And finally, that low-dimensional networks tend to suppress perturbations that are aligned with their low-dimensional structure. Those are 2 sort of main findings here. And I'd like to, once again, thank my undergraduate researcher who helped with this work. And happy to take any questions. Hope I was on time. I kind of, not too bad, I guess. Yeah. And of course, thank you for your time.
Quick question, maybe.
Sure.
I was in Paris last week. Spoke with a surgeon. I know he worked on these low-dimensional structures and generating these matrices from left and right eigenvectors. But as far as I understand his work, he he's interested in this superposition of low rank matrices and high rank matrices. But most of the analytics he does drop the noise, if I understand well. You probably know better than I do. But in your work, it seems that both parts of I mean, the suppression depends on this W1, right? I mean, at least the projection of W1 through the.
So I'd say the maybe the structure of the response is kind of modulated by W1, but actually in this work, W1 doesn't. We would reach mostly the same conclusions if we just assumed W1 was 0. And in fact, strictly speaking, I didn't write it out here, but the assumptions that we make is that W1 is at most order 1 in magnitude. So it could be less, it could be 0, right? The main difference between Surgeon's work and ours is that the low rank part W0 that he uses is not strongly low rank in the sense that it doesn't have large singular values. So the singular values are order 1. So when he does have a random part, for example, the low rank part is often larger than the random part, but not asymptotically so, right? And when he doesn't have it, W naught itself is not a matrix with large norm, I guess, right? So here, if you see assumption 1 here at the very end, I assume that the singular values sigma k of the low rank part are large. They go to infinity, and the limits we're interested in. So that's so he calls this a strongly low rank network, which is we've used the same terminology here, whereas he looks at what are called weakly low rank networks.
So he's got a 1 over n in front of this.
Yeah, so if you're looking at the individual components, if you take, let me go to the example we were looking at here. In this example, where you have biased elements in W, which in Surgeon's work he does, and also in this example we do, if the biased components have a scale, if the individual elements of W scale like 1 over n, then you get a weakly low rank network in the sense that the largest singular values are still order 1. In our work, we assume that we typically take the entries of W to scale like 1 over square root n, in which case when you have a bias, which you do here in these elements, that the largest singular values are going to scale like square root n. So they diverge. And that's the key difference between this work and Surgeon's work. And there's a lot of, in neuroscience, this has a lot of important implications for excitatory inhibitory balance and things like that.
Thank you.
Hi, can I add a question?
Sure.
So first, thank you. That's a great talk. One thing that was puzzling me, and that just might help with me like grappling with all the concepts. I've done some work with the bump attractor networks, and if you have a bump state, and I would have just thought that if you give input which is kind of locally coherent, but where you give it matters. So if you give it on the side of the bump, you'll get a very big response and change in the system. Whereas if you gave the same kind of net amplitude randomly across the network, I don't think it would have much effect on the position of the bump. So how does that connect? Because I would have thought if you gave this kind of Gaussian profile, but in the right location compared to where the bump is, it would have that would be the way to get the biggest effect.
Yeah, so I think the main difference here is in a bump attractor network, the bump that you get in the dynamics is a stable attractor, right? Whereas here, when we get a bump in the response, it's because we have it. So in practice, what you would do is you would provide an input that maybe looks like a bump, but then you would take that input away, and the bump would remain in the dynamics, right? Whereas here we're looking at, it's more like filtering a bump. You need to leave the input on so here the Z in response is only during the presentation of the stimulus. So this in this example, if we take the input away, the bump will disappear. So it's only filtering the input. Our theory would apply to bump attractors if the bump is a stable fixed point, but then we would be perturbing away from that bump, and we'd have to look at our connectivity then would be defined in terms of the Jacobian around the bump. I need to think about how this would apply to. I think that'd actually be a really interesting thing to look at, how this theory would apply to a bump attractor.
Okay.
But in this particular example, we don't have a bump attractor. The only attractor is 0 here, and the only reason we see a bump is because we sustain the input.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, those attractors are marginally stable. I don't know if that's a factor, but
right. Yeah. So that might violate some of our assumptions, I think.
Yeah.
But it could there might be some analogy or some extension that would apply. Definitely worth looking into, I think. Yeah.
I'm still a little surprised because if the connections were just not quite strong enough to sustain a bump, so 0 was the only fixed point, that an input that kind of match the bump that is very close to in parameter space is actually the one that gives the lowest response. That's a little surprising.
Yeah, so I think the thing is that this doesn't behave at all like a bump attractor, in the sense that the intrinsic dynamics of the network do not like to represent a bump. So the bump is actually, in the absence of input, very unstable. If you would start the initial conditions at a bump, it would move away from the bump more quickly than it would move away from a different stimulus. So what's happening is you actually have a negative feedback in the direction of the bump instead of a positive feedback.
Oh, I see. So the bright white in your connection matrix W in the top left is actually a maximum negative?
Yes, that's true, actually. I have to think back to exactly this example, but that's true. I think the example that where things are a little more subtle, which is what we looked at first, is when you have a structure where you have both excitatory and inhibitory neurons and a spatial structure. In that case, things are more complicated. But yeah, you're right. It is true in this case that it's negative. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
And that's necessary for the stability of the 0 fixed point when W is strong. Yeah.
And I have a question also related to, I believe in the examples that you showed about low dimensional representations in brain in your introduction.
Mm-hmm.
The input itself is low dimensional. So for the head position, for instance, the input is just one dimensional. So whatever the dynamics of your network is, you force it with a one-dimensional manifold. You expect maybe a little more or something that's going to be one dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take your own framework and have, in addition to these kind of low dimensional structures, a low dimensional input.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll typically get a low dimensional response as well. Yeah.
Will that depend on the alignment of the structure with the input? And how would plasticity map you? I mean, I don't know. It's kind of a very wide question, but
it would, yeah. So if we look at in the simplest case, if you have linear dynamics and we assume that things are slow, we get this quasi-static approximation can really kind of give you a lot of intuition for what's going on, if I can get to it. So here, if let's, in the simplest case, assume W is like a normal matrix, right? Then this inverse on the bottom of the screen here is kind of telling you if you allow yourself to ignore the identity, which does matter in some cases, but just very, very simplest case, when W is normal, we can mostly ignore that identity, and then basically W is suppressing the directions. The recurrent network is suppressing the directions to which W points the strongest. So if X is low dimensional, if it's low dimensional in other directions, then the dynamics will be low dimensional, right? If it's only low dimensional in the directions, it's sort of opposite of what you might expect. If X strongly points in the directions that W suppresses, then those two forces will kind of balance out and you can get actually high dimensional dynamics. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when X is non-normal, you have to be a little more careful, but you can get similar things happening. And similarly, when X varies fast, this quasi-static approximation is no longer true, but there's a analogous argument in frequency space. Thanks for all your questions. Are there any other questions?
All right. Well, I think,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Do well in all of the snow. Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah.